Imagine spending years screaming about needing a pipeline, finally getting someone to say yes, and then immediately questioning whether they actually mean it. Welcome to Canadian politics, where trust issues aren't just personal, they are federal policy. Pierre Poilievre just sat down with Brian Lilley for an exclusive year-end interview, and let me tell you, he had some thoughts about Mark Carney's Memorandum of Understanding with Alberta and whether this whole pipeline promise is real or just political theatre. I'm talking skepticism levels so high you'd think Poilievre was being asked to believe in Santa Claus again. This is Canadian Insights, where we cut through the political noise and get to what's actually happening, and today we're breaking down Poilievre's take on the MOU, why he thinks Carney might be bluffing, and what this all means for Alberta, pipelines, and the never-ending energy debate that's been tearing this country apart for years. Let's dive in. So first, let's set the stage because context matters here. Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada governor, former Bank of England governor, current Prime Minister, and the guy who Western Canada has loved to hate for years, suddenly signed a Memorandum of Understanding with Alberta about energy projects, including the possibility of new pipeline development. On paper, this sounds great, right? Finally, some cooperation between Ottawa and Alberta. Finally, someone in the Prime Minister's office acknowledging that energy infrastructure matters. Finally, a pathway forward that doesn't involve Alberta threatening to separate or Ontario lecturing everyone about climate commitments. But Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party and perpetual thorn in the Liberal government's side, is not buying it. Not even a little bit. He sat down with Brian Lilley and basically said, "Yeah, I'll believe it when I see it, and even then I'll probably still be suspicious." Poilievre's main argument is pretty straightforward. He doesn't think Mark Carney is serious about actually building a new pipeline. He thinks this MOU is a political band-aid, a way to calm down Alberta, reduce separatist sentiment, and make it look like the Liberals care about Western Canada without actually committing to anything concrete. It's the political equivalent of your friends saying they'll totally help you move, and then the day of the move they suddenly have a dentist appointment they forgot about. Sure, they said the right words, but were they ever really going to show up with a truck? Poilievre is betting no. And honestly, given the Liberal government's track record on pipelines, you can see why he's skeptical. We've seen pipeline projects die more times than a character in a soap opera. Northern Gateway, cancelled. Energy East, dead. Trans Mountain took so long and cost so much that people born when it was proposed are now old enough to drive. So yeah, forgiveness if there's some trust issues here. But let's talk about what this MOU actually says, because details matter and politicians love to hide in the vague language of agreements. A Memorandum of Understanding is not a legally binding contract. It's not a commitment to actually do anything. It's essentially a fancy handshake, a statement of intent, a "we promise to talk about this more later" kind of document. It's the political equivalent of saying let's keep in touch after meeting someone at a party, and we all know how often that actually happens. The MOU outlines cooperation on energy projects, mentions pipelines, talks about economic development, and uses a lot of words like collaboration and partnership that sound great but don't actually obligate anyone to do anything specific. Poilievre sees this for what it is, a public relations move designed to take the heat off the federal government while Alberta heads into that separation referendum in 2026. Now, why doesn't Poilievre believe Carney is serious about building a pipeline? Let's count the reasons, and trust me, there are several. First, Mark Carney has spent years as a climate advocate, pushing for green finance, talking about stranded assets in the fossil fuel industry, and generally positioning himself as someone who believes the world needs to move away from oil and gas as quickly as possible. That's his brand. That's what he's known for internationally. So the idea that he's suddenly going to champion a massive new pipeline project, something that environmental groups will absolutely lose their minds over, feels inconsistent at best and completely disingenuous at worst. It's like a vegan opening a steakhouse. Sure, they could do it, but would anyone actually believe they're committed to the concept? Second, the Liberal Party's base would riot. Not literally, but politically. The Liberals rely heavily on urban voters, environmental activists, younger demographics who care intensely about climate change, and progressive voters who see pipelines as symbols of everything wrong with the old economy. If Carney actually greenlights a new pipeline, he's going to face a civil war within his own party. The environmental wing of the Liberals would go ballistic. You'd have protests, op-eds, social media campaigns, MPs breaking ranks, the whole 9 yards. Carney knows this. He's not stupid. So Poilievre's argument is that Carney will string this along, make it look like he's trying, blame delays on consultations or regulatory processes or Indigenous concerns, and ultimately let the project die quietly without taking direct responsibility. It's the political version of death by 1,000 cuts, and we've seen this movie before. Third, and this is huge, even if Carney wanted to build a pipeline, the regulatory and legal obstacles are insane. Canada's pipeline approval process has become so complicated, so drawn out, and so vulnerable to court challenges that getting anything built is nearly impossible. You need federal approval, provincial approval, Indigenous consultation that's meaningful, not just checking boxes, environmental assessments that take years, court battles that go all the way to the Supreme Court, and even then you can still face protests and blockades. Trans Mountain, the one pipeline that actually did get built recently, took over a decade, required the federal government to literally buy the thing, and cost taxpayers billions more than projected. It was a nightmare. And that was for a pipeline expansion, not even a brand new project. So Poilievre is asking the obvious question: if Carney couldn't even make Trans Mountain happen smoothly when the government owned it, why would anyone believe he can make a new pipeline happen now? But here's where it gets interesting, because Poilievre isn't just criticizing. He's also laying out what he thinks the pros and cons of this MOU actually are, and his analysis is pretty revealing about his own political strategy. On the pro side, Poilievre acknowledges that any conversation between Ottawa and Alberta about energy is better than the hostile silence that's been the norm for years. At least they're talking. At least there's some recognition that Alberta's economy matters and that energy infrastructure isn't inherently evil. That's progress, even if it's minimal. The MOU also gives Alberta something to point to when the separatist movement says Ottawa doesn't care. Premier Danielle Smith can wave this agreement around and say, look, we're making headway, we're being heard, give Canada a chance. That's politically valuable for her, and it takes some wind out of the separatist sails, at least temporarily. On the con side, and this is where Poilievre really digs in, the MOU might actually make things worse if it turns out to be empty promises. If Carney signs this thing, makes Alberta think progress is coming, and then nothing happens, the backlash will be massive. It'll confirm every suspicion that Albertans have about Ottawa being dishonest, about central Canada not caring about the West, about the whole system being rigged against them. It'll fuel separatism rather than calm it down. It'll make Danielle Smith look naive for trusting the federal government. And it'll set back federal-provincial relations even further than they already are. So if this MOU is just for show, if there's no real intention to follow through, it's actually worse than doing nothing at all. At least with nothing, expectations are low and no one feels betrayed. With broken promises, you've got genuine anger. Supreme Court. Poilievre is also making a broader political point here, and it's one that resonates with his base. He's arguing that the Liberals don't actually understand or respect the resource economy that built this country. They talk a good game when they need Alberta's votes or when separatism gets scary, but fundamentally they see oil and gas as something to be phased out, not celebrated or supported. Poilievre positions himself as the opposite, someone who genuinely believes in resource development, who thinks pipelines are good for Canada, who wants to expand the energy sector rather than manage its decline. That contrast is central to his political brand. He's the guy who will actually build the pipeline, not just promise to think about maybe discussing it eventually if all the right conditions are met. And you know what, there's a real question here about sincerity on both sides. Is Carney genuinely trying to find a middle ground, or is this purely political calculation? Is Poilievre genuinely concerned about Alberta getting betrayed, or is he just trying to score political points by positioning himself as more pro-energy than the Liberals? Probably a bit of both, honestly. Politicians rarely do anything for just one reason. But the underlying issue is real. Canada desperately needs to figure out its energy policy, and we need to do it in a way that respects both economic realities and environmental concerns. Right now, we're failing at both. Our energy sector is struggling because we can't get products to market, and our climate goals are nowhere near being met because we haven't actually transitioned our economy in any meaningful way. We're stuck in this horrible middle ground where nobody's happy. The pipeline debate is really a proxy for a much bigger conversation about what kind of country Canada wants to be. Do we want to be a major energy producer, leveraging our resources for economic prosperity even if it means slower progress on emissions? Or do we want to be a climate leader, rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuels even if it means economic pain in certain regions? Ideally, we'd find a way to do both, but so far we've mostly just argued about it while other countries eat our lunch. The United States is producing more oil and gas than ever. Norway is a major oil producer and has incredible social programs funded by energy revenues. Canada could be doing similar things, but instead we're paralyzed by internal conflict. Here's the thing though, Poilievre might be right to be skeptical, but what's his alternative? If the Conservatives win the next election, What exactly will they do differently? Sure, they'll say yes to pipelines, but they'll face the same regulatory hurdles, the same court challenges, the same Indigenous consultation requirements, the same provincial jurisdictions that complicate everything. Saying you support pipelines is easy. Actually building them in Canada's current legal and political environment is incredibly hard, regardless of who's in power. Poilievre talks tough, and his base loves it, but governing is different from campaigning. He'll find that out if he becomes Prime Minister. So where does this leave us? We've got an MOU between Ottawa and Alberta that might mean something or might mean nothing. We've got Pierre Poilievre calling it out as potentially empty promises. We've got Mark Carney trying to hold together a fragile coalition while managing Western alienation and environmental concerns. We've got Alberta heading toward a separation referendum. And we've got an energy sector that's frustrated, an environmental movement that's anxious, and a country that can't seem to make up its mind about its own future. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's not getting resolved anytime soon. Alright, that's where we are. If you want to stay on top of all this political chaos, and trust me there's a lot of it, hit that subscribe button right now. Canadian Insights breaks down these stories every single day, multiple videos, all the context you need without the boring stuff. Drop a comment below. Do you think Carney is serious about building a pipeline, or is Poilievre right to be skeptical? What would you do if you were running the country? Let's talk about it, because this is the kind of debate that actually matters for Canada's future. Thanks for watching, I'm Canadian Insights, and I'll catch you in the next one.